Hi, everybody. It's episode 46 of Future Strong, and delighted as always to be here with Lindsey Pollak and this time with Shoshana Goldberg. My name's Nicky Garcea, and I am the co-founder and president of Capfinity. And if you have never watched this show before, and some of you who've watched all 46 episodes could probably put in chat what Capfinity does, but we're an organization that specializes in hiring and talent management, all powered by skills. We've got products that support Gen Z hiring, both from work simulations, preparation, feedback, and interview guides. And we are delighted to sponsor this show, run it every other Friday to talk about all things to strengthen individuals going to work in the future. So lovely to see you, Lindsey. Tell everyone a little bit about yourself.
Thank you so much. Hi, everybody. Please introduce yourselves in the chat. As always, we're happy to have you with us. My name is Lindsey Pollak. I am a proud ambassador for Capfinity, spreading the word about skills in hiring. I'm also, of course, president of the Nicky Garcea fan club. Nicky, very happy to have you back on the show. After being ill last episode. So glad to have you here. I'm the author of 4 career and workplace advice books, and I am a professional speaker and consultant to companies and universities. And Nicky, we haven't been together in a little while with all of our friends and viewers. Tell us what's going on with you. I know you've had a very busy couple of weeks in the UK.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm visited by my US colleagues this week, which has been wonderful as well. Some of them have never been to London, so that's been brilliant. 2 things I just wanted to share. One, we were part of an amazing event with Grad Island in Dublin just over 2 weeks ago. And if anybody would like to see any of that content, we presented with Accenture and the University of College Dublin, some of it focused on virtual reality, some of it focused on skills. Please drop us a note and let Lizzie, who is our director of behind the scenes here at Future Strong, know, and she will send you some recordings. And this week, I co-hosted a panel on neuroinclusion, which, and this is one of the reasons I'm so excited to speak to Shoshana today, is I probably learned more facilitating that panel than the people in the room did. So that was amazing. And we are writing a neuroinclusion playbook. So we will share that with everyone as well. But Lindsey, what have you been up to? And then we must get Shoshana involved.
Yes, well, first I want to welcome some of our viewers. We have our good friend Fred Burke in New York City today, Trudy Steinfeld, our colleague at Capfinity from Los Angeles. Pradeep is from Rochester, New York, and he asked the very important question where to sign up for the Nicky Garcea fan club. Pradeep, direct message me and I will add you to the committee. We have some leadership positions available. Well, big news here, 2 items to recommend. I recently launched my brand new LinkedIn Learning course, Managing a Multi-Generational Team. DM me if you'd like a free preview of the course, or if you have a LinkedIn Learning subscription, you can access that. And probably the biggest news to share, Nicky, here for the first time is that Nicky and I are working on a brand new book on hiring Gen Z with a skills-based perspective. So look for that coming out in the new year. If anyone is interested in sharing data or an interview for the book, we would love to hear from you. But enough about us, Nicky. We have a fantastic guest who I had the privilege of speaking on a panel with a couple months ago, and immediately, pretty much about 3 seconds after the panel ended, said, you need to come on our show, and you're right here, and you can't say no. So Shoshana Goldberg is with the Human Rights Campaign. I will let her introduce yourself. Shoshana, tell us about yourself, about your role at HRC, and how you came to do the very important work that you do. Welcome.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here. And yeah, Lindsey, I had the privilege of being on a panel with her about a month or 2 ago, and it was really great to learn from you. And so I'm really great to continue the conversation that we had then. So a little bit about me. So I have my master's in public health and my PhD in maternal and child health and epidemiology. I got that at UNC Chapel Hill. After graduating, I joined the faculty at MCH, as well as continued doing a lot of the research that I had started, both as a doctoral student, as a postdoc. And it really focused on understanding social and structural determinants of LGBT health disparities. Sort of a how do policies, whether they're state policies, federal policies, workplace policies, school policies, how do those impact health disparities? And while I really loved research and teaching, I started to get pretty frustrated with just sort of speaking to the research academic audience and not getting to do more of that like real world on the ground work. So from there, I kind of transitioned more into think tanks and research institutes. I spent 3 years consulting with the Williams Institute, where I did a lot of demography and policy focused research. And now I am in my current role at the Human Rights Campaign, where I'm the Director of Public Education and Research. So I'm at the HRC Foundation, which is our nonprofit arm, where we kind of do all of our work around conducting research and programming to improve and understand the health and well-being of LGBTQ people across all spaces of daily life, including at work. So while I'm here, like I conduct a lot of research, sort of everything from understanding the scope of COVID's impact on the LGBT community to understanding ways that we can adjust our workplace policies to better serve the needs of our LGBT employees, to understanding and fighting back against a rise of anti-LGBT legislation that we're seeing and anti-LGBT rhetoric that we're also seeing kind of following suit.
Thank you, Shoshana. So you've got such an incredible career. For you to condense it into a couple of minutes is quite something. Thinking about your focus of your work right now, I'd love you to share with us some of the things that are really current on your mind when it comes to supporting LGBTQ employees right now in the workplace and students. What are some of the topics that you're focused on?
Yeah, so I think what we're seeing right now is two things. So one, and I think this is the bad news, is that we have seen the worst year of anti-LGBTQ legislation of record. It increasingly is putting LGBTQ people and parents and families of LGBTQ youth in the impossible situation of staying in the state where they work, live, and have community versus keeping themselves and their loved ones safe. And as an aside, I just want to make sure, I know I keep saying the acronym LGBTQ. Sometimes you may hear the acronym LGBT or LGBTQ+. I might use these interchangeably, and they're sort of meant to encompass the full range of sexual and gender identities other than heterosexual or straight. So there's straight heterosexual people versus all other sexual minority identities. Sometimes I'll use queer as kind of a catch-all for all non-heterosexual identities. And we also talk about transgender versus cisgender. So cisgender is somebody who's sex assigned at birth matches their gender identity. So if you think about somebody who was assigned female at birth, has female anatomy, identifies as a woman, that would be somebody who is cisgender. Somebody is transgender is somebody who identifies as a different gender. And that may be that they identify as a man, as non-binary, as genderqueer, or something else altogether. So now that we kind of have that tone setting, I just also want to make sure that if I do use any other terminologies that you're not familiar with, like feel free to drop it in the chat and I can pause. And I know Nicky and Lindsey are also going to be tracking it. So I'll be happy to clarify any terms that I use. Okay, so back to the bad news, unfortunately. So in 2022, for example, 25 anti-LGBTQ bills have been enacted, 17 of which were anti-transgender laws across 13 states. More than 145 bills were introduced across 34 states. Already we're seeing states start to pre-file bills for the next state legislative session. And with the House's leadership changing, although largely in a pretty minor way, there are also some concerns that we might see some federal legislation as well, although that's likely to be vetoed or not make it out into the Senate or the president's desk. That being said, what this means is that we are seeing youth and adults living and working in states where their rights are directly under attack. And so we are looking for ways that we can kind of figure out how to address that. So, making sure that employers are able to sort of step up and kind of fill in the gaps. So what does it mean if a state bans certain care? Are there ways to, at least ensure and enshrine like non-discrimination protections or access to care for their staff or their staff's dependents? So we've seen, some companies stepping up and having travel benefits for their employees who need to travel out of state to get an abortion, similar for transgender employees or those who have transgender youth. Transgender children or spouses, we'd want to see travel benefits that would allow transgender people to travel out of state to get the gender affirming care that they need. Right now we talk about this as sort of like the right thing to do, but it also is the smart thing to do, because the good thing is that like the LGBTQ population is not going anywhere. Like we already are here, And particularly among younger generations who are increasingly coming out at younger ages, they're wanting to not only come out, but stay out and live out and proud in every aspect of their life, including at work. So employers really have this opportunity to not only do the right thing for like the right and moral thing to do, but also the right thing by a workforce that is becoming increasingly more queer and wanting to have a workplace that is increasingly more willing to allow them to be queer. And Lindsey, I know you do a lot of this like mixed generation stuff. Same thing with Gen Z. We know that like Gen Z in general also has much more pro-equality views. And they also are going to want to be at workplaces where they know that their employer holds values that they hold and lives those values every day, not just on Pride Month. So, figuring out the ways that you can do it at a corporate level, at an individual level to sort of make your workforce more inclusive and more welcoming to LGBTQ employees is not only going to do right by your employees, but it's going to make it easier to recruit and retain your employees.
So Shoshana, I want to bring in some data. I've seen stats, and tell me if these are true, that Gen Zs identify as LGBTQ at double the rates of even millennials. So I know we've seen a lot of change over long periods of time, but even just in recent times, not just the support, but the identification is much higher. Is that what you're seeing? Because a lot of people here on the show work with students.
Yeah, so like, for example, in the Gallup daily tracking study, I think it's now called the Gallup Social Goals or something like that. They've been tracking LGBT identity across generations since 2012. In this most recent year, 1 in 5, a little bit over 20% of Gen Z identified as LGBTQ. We're not saying that there's more people who are LGBTQ, although I do think in some sense that our understanding and visibility of sexual and gender identities has expanded. More and more people are realizing that these are identities that they hold that maybe they didn't have labels for before. But yeah, Gen Z is just, they're feeling more comfortable coming out. And that is because prior to recent years, like we were seeing like large strides in public acceptance and visibility of LGBTQ people. I mean, the nice thing is that even as these policies are happening, public opinion is still generally much more pro-equality. Like the vast majority of Americans support same-sex marriage, they support non-discrimination protections, they support like protections and that's both for sexual and gender minorities, so trans people and queer people. And Gen Z is really leading that cause. So yeah, exactly. Gen Z not only is the most likely to identify as LGBTQ, but they're also the most pro-equality generation. And, I did this work prior to the midterms where we were looking at kind of estimating, for example, the voting eligible population, which you defined as 18 and up. So that's really not just voting eligible, but also going to be sort of those future new workers and kind of the incoming workforce. And really seeing that by like 2040, about 1 in 5 or 7, about 18% of all Americans are going to be potentially like LGBTQ if we see sort of the same trends occurring.
Yeah. I want to remind the audience to introduce yourselves and share any questions or comments or experiences with us. We do have a global audience, Shoshana, and you and I have had, and Nicky, some interesting conversations about the World Cup starting in Qatar and people sending employees around the world. It's very common that companies will be sending people to countries that might have different laws than their own. Can you talk, and you're certainly not an expert on the policies of every country in the world, but also moving states, moving countries, what do employers need to be aware of when they are sending employees to countries that might have a different policy or just attitude towards LGBTQ employees? Yeah,
and like, I think you make a good point. Like, it's impossible to say there's one hard and fast rule, because sending somebody to Florida, for example, which has had like most consistent anti-LGBT legislation this past year, is very different than sending them to Iceland or the Netherlands, which are like two of the most inclusive countries for LGBT folks, versus sending them to China, where there's sort of growing rumors about all gender affirming care being cut off. And so what that means is that as an employer, it's your responsibility to really know what are the rules and policies and regulations in the places that you're sending your employees. So knowing, for example, if you have an employee who's transgender and is on gender affirming care, they're taking, hormones on a daily or weekly basis. If you're sending them to a country where maybe that care is not available, figuring out ways to work with them, or letting them know that this might not be available so that they can work with their doctor or healthcare provider to find ways to ensure that they don't have a disruption in care. Similarly, knowing if you're going to send an employee to a country that maybe is more explicitly anti-LGBTQ in their policies, figuring out ways to either keep them safe or have them not travel at all. One of the silver linings of the pandemic is this rise in the ability to have more of a hybrid workforce, and more tools have been developed that allow people to connect and communicate and work together without necessarily having to be in person. So maybe there are ways that you can work with that employee to have them still do these projects, but remotely, or have somebody else go in their stead, but still have them still maintain a leadership role. So those are some of the things that you can do, but it's really the burden is on you to kind of figure out what's going on in that place, and also what your employees need. And so I think that's sort of what I would sort of say, is to kind of just also begin to think about it. Like, I know it's not a thing that we're used to thinking about, particularly if maybe your C-suite is largely cis and straight, but knowing that you do have queer employees because we're everywhere, and trans employees because they're everywhere, is sort of a thing to start thinking about, having that be part of like the standard process that you would do when you're considering any sort of aspect of safety and well-being when sending an employee abroad.
Such practical advice, Shoshana, and I want to delve into it a little bit more. First of all, just to say hi to Jane Mattison and Dawn Carter, very loyal guests of the show. So wonderful to have you with us. You've started to give some really practical perspectives, and as an employer, I'm finding this valuable, what you're sharing. Could you share a little bit more about broader inclusive practices that you've seen employees demonstrate or employers demonstrate? And I don't know if you can kind of give any shout outs to employers or just really good practice. It would be great to hear more.
Yeah, so first of all, I'm going to plug one of my colleagues' projects over here at HRC.
We love a plug. We love a plug. We have
a whole workplace equity team, and we put out every year something called the Corporate Equality Index. So what this is, it is both companies have the ability to like opt into it, as well as we also will analyze, the Fortune 500 companies that have their policies listed online or publicly available. And what we do for that is we have basically a scale, or we rank employees based on whether they have a set of policies. So it's really a great resource and sort of a roadmap for what we consider an inclusive or welcoming environment. And so that includes things like, do you have sexual orientation and gender identity explicitly enumerated in your employment non-discrimination policy? So regardless of what's happening in your state, you are saying that as an employee, like, you will not hire, fire, promote, etc., based on sexual orientation or gender identity. Similarly, we also talk about healthcare inclusive policies. So that's, does your health insurance plan cover gender affirming care, both for the employee and for their dependents? Does it cover any sort of fertility preservation for employees, or any sort of like IVF or fertility treatments in general for all couples, regardless of the gender makeup of the two partners? We've seen in the past where some employees will have an IVF benefit that's only for other sex couples. It's not available for same-sex couples, because that's not considered like as much of a need as like a medical need that IVF would necessitate, which is insane, because I would argue that not having both sperm and a uterus available in a couple is a medical need for having other reproductive technology available. And we also talk about things like, do same-sex or do spousal benefits in general expand beyond just a married couple, but to all sort of ways that people can form a family, including as well as parental leave. So is it not just if a person gives birth, but if they adopt or foster a kid? We talk about, things like inclusive culture. So, what sort of practices do they have in place? Do they do diversity trainings? Do they do internal evaluation about when they look at, benchmarking and assessments of sort of what's the demographic makeup of our C-suite or our management level versus our incoming class? Do they have policies around that also include sexual orientation and gender identity as metrics in which they evaluate, besides just like gender, race, or age? We actually just put out another plug. My team just put out a piece specifically on how to collect inclusive self-identification. So one of the ways that we can take, one of the first steps really to improve LGBT equity in your workforce is to know how many LGBTQ employees you have. and where they are and figuring out, are they, is there disparities? Are they mostly concentrated in certain types of jobs or certain levels? And to do that sort of benchmarking, you need to collect that information. So we have an entire guide for how employees can include these questions on the demographic questions that people fill out as new hires, as well as advice for how to start to collect that on an existing workforce and sort of the language that you can use to ensure and explain why you're doing it, so that people know that their data is being kept safe and also that it's being used to help the workforce and not as something more nefarious.
That is such good information. I'm taking rapid notes, Nicky, and I know you are too. We have a very special comment for you, Shoshana, from Trudy Steinfeld, who works on the Capfinity team and is such a valued asset, is also the former head of career services at NYU. Cool. Such great to hear this info and understand the inequities. On a random note, Trudy's daughter, Dr. Kate Rosinski, was with Shoshana at Carolina Public Health. So you worked with the daughter of someone here. And I want to talk about your experience on campus, because so many of our viewers work in career services, work in higher ed, and certainly we're all interested in Gen Z and what's happening on campus, where I think a lot of these issues are very prominent. Can you talk about some ways that universities and grad schools can support LGBT students? And some of this, I really like you to address this idea. Kids today are so woke, and why do we have to use pronouns? And a lot of the issues that seem controversial, I think the more you dig into them, are not at all controversial, and are human rights issues, which I think is so poignant that that's the name of Human Rights Campaign. Talk about what's going on campus. Yeah. You've been there. You've been with students. You work with students. Yeah, talk about that for us, please.
Yeah, so a few things. So my favorite thing is people say, like, oh, I don't use pronouns, which is insane, because every single person has a pronoun. Like, a pronoun is not a thing that just trans people have or genderqueer people have. Every single human and often a lot of like inanimate objects like boats and cars have pronouns. So when we say that, when we like talk about, pronoun policies, this is one of these like really easy, simple things that everybody can do to help create like a welcoming and inclusive environment. And the reason why, because it's like, I know it seems weird because we haven't had, many of you have not had to think about pronouns because you're cis, because that is sort of the default, is that you are cisgender and you present as your gender. And it's so called like obvious that you're a woman or a man, and therefore your pronouns would be she or he. But the reality is that's not the case for everybody. And simply by assuming that, you are also like perpetuating this idea that there is one way to look as a certain gender and present as a certain gender, which is not even the case for many like cisgender people who are gender nonconforming in the way that they present. But when we say that, we talk about pronouns, like we talk about, and I know this may seem a bit rogue, but this idea of privilege and sort of this thing of, if trans people are the only people who are saying their pronouns, or they're only people who are correcting somebody's names, then that's constantly putting the burden on them, who are already in a vulnerable place because they're being required to come out every time they enter into a new room, when maybe they don't want to, or they don't want to have to be the first person, where it just kind of calls attention to them in a way that they don't really need to have attention called to them. They're just trying to say, you're going around in a circle and you're saying your name, and you just like don't want to be called the wrong name or the wrong pronoun. And so by having everybody put their pronouns, be that like in their Zoom signature, on their like placard outside of their office or their cubicle, that makes it so that it's not, the burden is not on the trans person to have to identify it, but that it becomes a normalized thing that everybody is used to doing. So it doesn't like automatically call people out or call attention to somebody. It's a way to kind of call everybody in to the act of like working together to make an inclusive environment. And just like, it's a nice and easy thing to do. And it's also like when you are maybe in a state that is rapidly restricting the things that you can offer and do because of, as a teacher, you can't talk about certain things because you can't say gay or trans, or you can't offer certain healthcare because it's banned in your state. The least you can do is at least like do small things like say pronouns and making that normalized. But going back to campus, I think that one of the things that's really helpful is, and again, the question is always sort of, or not even the question, the action is really on doing your research. And so when you're talking about, if you're like a career services person, you have a student coming to you and they're queer and they want to know what's going to be a safe environment for them to go to, you can look at the CEI, and we also actually have, a whole ranking of like the best places to work where you can look at, and these are all the employers that have been ranked, they scored 100 in our equality index. They have all these policies in place that in our research and our understanding really does create an equitable environment. So you can say, okay, well, this employee, they scored 100 on the CEI and they're in this state, or they have a remote or hybrid workplace where even though maybe they're based in Florida, like you can work in New York where it's going to be more inclusive and welcoming for you. Also, just even knowing what's on that CEI and what's on that index, so you can use it as a roadmap to work with that student. Because, there's like hundreds of thousands of companies out there. We can't rank all of them. And so what you could do, though, is if you can find that employee's policies, you can say, okay, well, they do have these things that the CEI looks for. And so that can kind of help them to, guide where they could know is something going to be safe. And then also just sort of, again, like similar to what we were saying earlier about with the global workforce, making sure that what are the policies in a state. And so that you can say to them like, hey, this is a state where there are these policies in place. You might want to, if you want to take this job, you might want to talk with the employer about ways that they can allow you to either work somewhere else remotely or that figure out what policies they have in place to protect you.
Shoshana, you are practicality personified, and there's people in the chat thanking you for the resources that you curated prior to this episode and that Lizzie's been sharing. Thank you, Jane, for the shout out for that. There will be people listening back to this episode and they're not in DE&I roles, they're maybe not even in HR roles, and they will be wondering as individuals, what can they do to support LGBTQ individuals more? And that might be employees around them, it might be students that they're working with. What are some of the things that we can all do more of kind of in the coming days and weeks?
Yeah. So, one of the things that I like to say is, like, I know when we have like DEI and like HR that like sometimes it makes it seem like diversity is this big action that has to be taken. But like LGBT people are ultimately people. And so the way that they need to be treated is the same way you would want to treat anybody, or you would want to be treated, which is with like respect and dignity, and honoring them. And that can be as small as like using the names and pronouns that they use so that you are honoring their identity and acknowledging it instead of like pushing back on it. Or that could be as big as, working with an employee resource group that they might have at your company that's like an LGBTQ one, to push for policies and sort of say like, here's what the CEI says are policies, we don't have them, let's push to get these policies implemented in your workforce. It could be things like, every time we put out resources at HRC, we often have a call to action, and that may be everything from calling your senator, writing a representative, signing on to a letter, pushing back against a policy, showing up when there are bills working through the state house and joining in a protest. Like, everyone really can figure out for themselves what is the ways that they want to get involved. But the important thing is to sort of know what are the things that work for you, and know that like the important thing is to work towards improving the lives and well-being and of your LGBTQ employees and your friends and your colleagues, because they're not just this small, tiny little group where like a large population that's going to continue to grow and continue to be here and if they are not already, they will be your family members, your friends, your colleagues, your bosses, your supervisees, and also just the people on the street, because we continue to be people and will continue to be here.
Can I ask one question,
Sure.
just additional question, and then Lindsey, I know that you are, I don't know how you're going to summarize this, so I'm, slightly cheekily wondering, me too. Employee resource groups, can you just give us 10, 15 seconds on some of the best practice that you've seen?
I think the best practice, so like, I can talk about what happened at HRC, which was that our own employee resource group went through and figured out where our own like healthcare policies or leave policies were not fully aligning with the CEI, and was able to work with the ERG and with leadership to have our employee policies expanded. And also like seeing that the rising cost of healthcare, particularly like fertility treatments, led to us having this additional benefit, which is called Carrot, which is like a additional reproductive health only focused form of insurance, which covers everything from like fertility preservation and sperm banking to IVF to IUI to all the different things that you would need to have a child when you want to have a child. And that was really led through our own employees sort of using the CEI and doing a sort of internal evaluation of what our employees needed and making sure that our leadership was able to give that to them.
Thank you. So helpful. Lindsey, if you would just summarize, and before you do, Shoshana, on behalf of Capfinity, I just want to thank you for the investment that you put into preparing for this session, which is so clear, for everything that you've shared. It's been incredibly practical. And Lindsey, I'm going to say 3, but what are some of the takeaways that you're going to summarize for us?
Yes, my number 1 strength, according to the Capfinity Strengths Profile, is narration. So Shoshana, I'm asked at the end of every episode to summarize what has gone
Oh my God, I'd love to hear it.
Yeah, you have to take your strengths profile. Yeah. Thank you, Shoshana Goldberg of Human Rights Campaign. You are so generous in your knowledge and practicality, and that is such a gift to all of us. 3 takeaways on our conversation for supporting LGBTQ students and employees. Number 1, supporting this population is not just a nice thing to do or the right thing to do. It is a smart thing to do. It is about respect and dignity. Number 2, learn more, do your research, be knowledgeable. I think it was probably an eye-opener for many people that when we send employees to do business in other states and other countries, those might not be safe environments for all employees. And it is our burden as employers to look into that safety and those policies and support employees. And you made the great point that hybrid work can be a real gift to some of the situations that are happening. Number 3, some policies that you recommended are looking at your healthcare plan and making sure that it is inclusive to all people, all parents, all those who identify in a variety of ways. We as individuals can and should use our pronouns on our Zoom screens and our email signatures when we introduce ourselves, not because people don't know what we identify as, but to be supportive and take the burden off of particularly transgender employees who don't want to always be the ones to have to introduce this to the conversation. Again, I just want to say thank you, not just for sharing such practical resources, and we have so many links in the chat for everybody, but to remind us that this is an issue of respect and dignity, and every single human deserves that. And thank you for all of the work that you do. Shoshana, we will give you the last word, but first, Nicky is going to talk about our next guest coming up on Future Strong in 2 weeks. Nicky.
Thanks, Lindsey. Yeah, we're very excited to have the author and academic Wendy K. Smith, co-founder and co-director of the Women Leadership Initiative from the University of Delaware. And I hope we can talk to her a little bit, Lindsey, about her last book. And yeah, very much looking forward to that episode and hope many of you will join us. Shoshana, we'll let you conclude.
Thank you. So yes, I think just the very fact that I'm here and that there are people who are excited to hear from me on this topic is a really amazing sign. Just 5-10 years ago, I don't think this would have happened. People would not have even known or thought to think about LGBTQ people or want to work on how to improve their lives and make their workplaces or their schools or whatever more inclusive. So I just love that this is happening. Again, I'm going to plug a few things. So I talked about the Corporate Equality Index. Another thing that we have is we have a whole team that does corporate public policy engagement. They have regular calls. They do sign-on letters. They have companies will sign on to amicus briefs. So I'll send that link along. I should have sent that on earlier. So those are things that you can talk to your own employers about if you want to see them step up more. Because, we all, you were saying, it's about dignity, it's about the smart thing to do and the right thing to do. It's about a thing that we should be doing year round, not just in June. And more and more people are going to want to see that. And there are ways to do that. And so I'm excited to be in this fight with all y'all and keep, see where it goes from here. But I'm hopeful. I'm more hopeful than I am pessimistic, even in spite of this legislation, because I think that the public is on the right side And I think that there is this real groundswell of people looking and hoping to make the world better. And I'm excited to be in this with all of you.
Thank you so much,
Thank you.
Shoshana. Thank you, Lindsey. I hope everyone has safe and brilliant weekends. Take care.
Thank you.